Everyone. Welcome to the Pacific Division Feeding Capacity Building Series. This series is brought to you by the Pacific Division Feeding Leadership. My name is Yi Wei. I am a volunteer from the Los Angeles region, and I'll be your host for this series. We are very excited to welcome you all to our third session. And I'm extremely excited when I see all your names in the chat and putting your regions and everything. Thank you so much. You know how excited I get when I see you all. Last week, we saw almost 300 of you live on Teams, and we saw additional 100 people on YouTube watching the previous session. So again, I'd like to encourage you to type your name and the region in the chat to say hi to each other. This is really, help us to get to know each other and find mentorships and find our future friends in disasters. We'll be using the same Teams link for each session. Double check your time zone before you join the Teams. It's 5:30 p.m. Pacific Daylight Savings Time. I know Pacific Islands, they're ahead of us, or some of the regions are ahead of us and some of the territories are behind us. So double check your time before you join. Your camera and microphones have been disabled for the time being. You're able to type your questions in the chat, and the microphone will be open towards the end for Q&As. And always remember to log in your hours in Volunteer Connection. This series is not a required course to obtain a group activity or position. It is designed to help all of us to build confidence and to hear best practices. You will not receive EDGE credit, unfortunately, or certificates for this series. And the Pacific Division has 10 regions and cover 10 states or territories. If you're not able to attend the live session, all the presentations are recorded and it will be published on YouTube within a week with a follow-up email. And you can also subscribe to our Pacific Division YouTube channel. Go on YouTube, search Pacific Division Red Cross, and you'll see the channel. Then you will get notified when we post a new video. And all the previous sheltering videos are also on there as well. And before we get started with today's topic, I'd like to share with you our upcoming sessions. So next week, March the 27th, we're going to talk about different types of feeding, whether it's congregate feeding, outreach feeding, or canteening. Then on April the 3rd, we're going to talk about local partnerships in steady state and operational state, and how we arrange for and pay for food during a disaster or during blue sky activity or so-called steady state activities. The following week, we're going to talk about field kitchens. It's very rare for the California or any Pacific Division to use field kitchen. But when you're deployed to a hurricanes or tornadoes in the east or in Texas, Florida, you'll see a lot of field kitchens. So we'll talk about that. We will also talk about how to be a headquarters feeding manager. And the one thing that we really hate, but we can, and it's really useful for us, and it's forms. So one of the sessions we're going to talk about forms and follow-ups. And the first session of May, we're going to talk about how to be a great supervisor and how to supervise disaster event-based volunteers. And I look forward to seeing you all for those sessions. If you're not able to make it, no worries, everything will be recorded. I'd also like to share with you the upcoming Mass Care webinar. That is tomorrow. It's 2 o'clock to 3:30 p.m. That's Eastern time. And it's always the third Thursday of the month. And tomorrow is very exciting. Mariana and her team that put together for the information service, the new web EOC. They're going to talk about the regional readiness activities for pets in shelters. They're also going to talk about sheltering activity updates, shelter resident transition activity updates. I highly encourage you to attend that. The really good thing about the Mass Care webinar is that if you're not able to make it, you can just click on the link and they'll give you the live presentation afterwards. So you don't have to wait for it to get published. If you click the link after the session or at any time, you can just go ahead and join. Okay, with that, I'd like to turn back to Mary for her presentation on Food for Thought, the Psychology of Eating.
Thanks, Iwe. And hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm really glad to be here. I am actually back in California, Monterey, California. So again, there shouldn't be any internet issues as some of you experienced on the first session. So let's start this evening about how we talk about food or feeding. Next slide. If you want to change behaviors, you have to change the way you talk about a behavior or you talk about something. So I'm going to tell you tonight that language matters, language around the food we serve. And in our particular region, we are trying to use the word cuisine rather than food to elevate the feeling that our clients in the shelters get. Next slide, please. Which would you want to eat? What do you picture when someone says feeding versus dining or feeding versus mealtime? I want you to take a minute and think about that. Next slide. Okay, take a peek. When you say dining, when you say mealtime, when you say feeding, which one conjures the best image for you? Next slide, please. We don't just eat with our mouths, believe it or not. We eat with our eyes, our nose, even our feeling senses, the sense of touch. Whether we're picking up a sandwich and the sandwich is soggy, that's one of the ways that we are experiencing the food. Whether we are having scrambled eggs in the morning and all of a sudden you crunch into a shell, that's the way we experience food. So one of the things I try and help people understand is that feeding, cuisine, food, it's more than just about the calories we put in our mouth. Next slide, please. So right now, our focus it's about quality, not cost. And I'm going to also say it's about quality, not just quantity. And we're going to get to the quantity issue. My partner, Michael, will be covering that a little bit. But right now, I want to talk about the quality that we receive for the cost. Next slide, please. First and foremost, let me be perfectly clear about this. There is no national cost per meal standard. People ask me that all the time. They say, well, what are we supposed to, per day, what are we supposed to spend per client? There is no national cost. And think about it. If you are doing food in rural Alaska, let's say, it's going to be real different than the cost of food in Los Angeles. Or if you're doing food in Kansas, it's going to be real different than the cost of food in New York City. So it makes perfect sense that we can't have a national, this is the price you spend on food. Next slide, please. So how does it work? So how do we get to, getting high quality food at a reasonable price? Next slide. Here are a few ways. First of all, you need to know your service delivery plan. And that will tell you, there's one on every DR, and that will tell you what your budget is. You need to know your budget. Now, maybe your budget has to be increased based on factors that come into play after the DR starts. But if you know your budget and work with your supervisor, you'll be able to accomplish that. Use our national partners. Those national partners have already agreed to a certain price for delivery of the meal. Contact your local vendors during steady state or blue skies, as we refer to it sometimes. Be reasonable. This is not there's no set cost, so go ahead and order steak and lobster. That's not the case. Yes, we want high quality food, but we have to be reasonable. You need to consider that medical, religious, and cultural meals may cost you a little bit more. You might have to go to a different vendor other than one of our national partners or someone you're currently working with to get those particular meals, those specific meals. But when in doubt, just always check with your supervisor and they will help you make those decisions. Next slide, please.
Hi, Mary. Before we jump to the next slide, I heard the name DR. Would you mind sharing with us what does DR stand for?
I'm sorry, a disaster that, and it was a shortened version, a DRO, a disaster relief operation.
Thank you so much. And I have a little more trickier question.
Okay.
Well, service delivery plan. So let's say you're a service associate. This is your first time, working in a shelter or working a feeding operation. Whom would you ask to get the information on the budget, and whom can you find out for your service delivery plan?
Well, you can always talk to whoever you are reporting to. If it's a large disaster relief operation, then you have a feeding lead or a feeding manager or feeding supervisor. If you're in a shelter and you're given feeding responsibilities, it would be your shelter supervisor, shelter manager.
Thank you so much, Mary. And I do see
Certainly.
some questions in the chat. We'll pause when Mary and Michael switch and we'll answer the question then. I'll go ahead and move to the next slide.
Okay, and be assured that we know it ran long last time. We have left ample time for questions. We will not leave you short. So let's talk about the meal itself. Next slide. So this is taken exactly from one source, or the Red Cross the feeding toolkit, excuse me, and it's the cuisine guidelines. And they say a meal consists of a single serving of food consisting of the following: an 8-ounce entree, 6-ounce of vegetable, 6-ounce of fruit, bread, snack, and a 16-ounce water. Now, here's the dilemma at this point, and I'm able to share with you that National is working with USDA to come up with a little bit more refined guidelines. However, that is certainly a long way off. You can imagine that big of a bureaucracy, it's going to take a while. So don't be expecting anything this disaster season, hurricane, fire, tornado, whatever, or even maybe next one, but they are working on it. Here's what I do. I'm specific with my vendors that I want of that 8-ounce entree, I want a certain amount to be protein, either animal protein or plant protein, if it's a vegetarian. But I am looking at a 6-ounce protein to be part of the entree. In other words, you could ask for an 8-ounce entree and get 8 ounces of mac and cheese or 8 ounces of pasta. And that's not exactly the most, what I want to say, healthiest food that you could do. So while this is the guidelines directly from the Red Cross, we have to work with our vendors, we have to work with our national partners to make sure we're getting the quality and the proportions of the food that we want. Next slide. So here's an example to ensure that we're getting that high quality nutritional cuisine. And it's not all about nutrition and cuisine. I know there's comfort food out there, and there's nothing I like better than a big plate of mashed potatoes, but we also want to have a really good balanced meal for our clients. So be specific with your vendors and partners, especially when you're talking to them in steady state. Have those conversations about, look, if you're going to do pasta for us, we need a 4-ounce meatball with that, or something to that effect. When the meals are delivered, check on the meals. it's okay to look and see what it is they're delivering. The best way to get good feedback is ask the client. Was that enough food for you? Let me tell you, sometimes there are hiccups. And I'll give you an example where I hiccuped this last summer in one of the fires in California. My particular Subway that I used to go to all the time uses a big 14-inch tortilla. So for the wraps, I ordered the 14-inch tortilla wraps and had them cut them in half, which would give them about a maybe 6.5 inch wrap for lunch. Well, the particular Subway I was using used a 12-ounce tortilla. So by the time they cut it and wrapped it, my little wrap was close to 4 inches. So that was a little hiccup, but it's okay. That happened to work out okay because we had extra. But ask the client, did they get enough food? Did they like the food? Was it good? And don't be afraid to say something if the quality is not there. Again, the Red Cross wants to ensure that we're taking really good care of our clients and that they're getting a quality meal. Next slide. The other big thing about making sure we have great food and the philosophy of feeding is a variety of the cuisine offerings. How would you feel about eating the same thing every day or even every other day? What drives me absolutely crazy is when I hear someone say, it's Tuesday, oh, we must be having spaghetti. So mix it up, make it a variety, both with our partners or if you're using local vendors. As they say, variety is the spice of life. So let's put a little variety in our cuisine. Next slide, please. So, food for thought. If you don't remember anything I said tonight, remember this. As a member of the feeding team, you get a chance to provide comfort and support. And on the worst day of people's lives, the feeding staff gets to make people feel better through the food we serve, the smiles we share with them when we're serving it, and the kind word we can give them. So please, if you don't remember anything, remember being a part of this team is awesome. I have a quick follow-up from last week, so I think I have one more slide for you. Yes, as promised from last week, go ahead. So this is a direct quote from Lauren Myers, Senior Program Manager, National Feeding and Distribution Emergency Supplies Program. This is a quote. Feeding does not count snacks. It does not matter if the snacks are served in a shelter, a fixed feeding site, or out of an ERV. The 5266 does an automatic estimate of the snacks served based on shelter counts and meals served. So if you're being asked by a local person for some reason, we don't have anything to say about that, but we don't count snacks anymore. And the last thing I want to let you know, that some people had asked for copies of the feeding kits. And if you will type your name, I don't think I have a slide on this, Eway, but you can look. Oh, we do. If you will type your name and just put feeding kits next to it in the chat, Eway will make sure that you get a sample. This is what we use in Gold Country, and I'm sure there's other regions in this division that do that as well. So just type that in there, and she'll make sure you get it. And that's my part. So I want to turn it back to Eway for Michael.
Thank you so much, Mary. I see a lot of people that commenting on feeding kids. And Mary, would you be okay if I sent to the whole entire group and specify that this is, a sample from Gold Country? Does that work for you?
Absolutely. Sorry, I didn't think that many people would want it.
Thank you so much.
Okay,
we
you guys
all
can
want
stop.
it. We're sharing best practices. We all want it. Mary, do you think we can pause and take a few questions?
let's see. Yes, we could take a few questions, but then I'd like to keep them after a couple to keep them for the end.
Sure, perfect. Thank you so much. One of the questions that we have is, where can we find the list of RC national partners? I did include the link to OneSource in the chat, but I'm also wondering if you or Michael that has any best practices to find the national partners.
Really, they're at OneSource. They're all there, and there aren't a lot of them. I believe there are 4, maybe 5.
Thank you. And we have a question that if we're in a predominantly Muslim area during Ramadan, do we delay meal or serve twice?
Oh, that's a very good question. And to be honest with you, I have never come across that. So, Michael, let me toss it to my colleague, Michael, and see if he's come across that.
I have not either.
I would say check with your shelter supervisor if it's feasible to serve the meal later. Of course, it depends. Oh, you know what? We have so much expertise on the line. Can I toss it to Kay Ashton? I think she might have a response.
Actually, what I would do is I would check with the local religious leader. They should be easy to find, and ask them.
Perfect. That's always the best, is to go to the source. And then between you and that religious leader and your shelter supervisor, I'm sure you can come up with something that's going to be fitting for your entire the entire population. Okay, Michael.
Thank you so much. And let's go to Michael. Michael is our volunteer from Goat Country, and he is our territory feeding coordinator for Goat Country Sacramento chapter. Michael, it's all yours.
Good evening, everyone. I'm happy to be here, and hopefully you'll find this presentation informative. So those of you who have been involved in Red Cross feeding, you know that food safety is an essential part of the preparation, delivery, and service of that food. And while the kitchen manager and the supervisor have overall responsibility for ensuring safe food handling, all volunteers need to understand their role in ensuring the safety of the food, the protection of equipment and facilities, which ultimately protects the clients. I always remind my staff that the clients are in a great deal of stress. They're not home, they're outside of their normal routines, they're worried about their homes, their families, their jobs, and this can affect the immune system, which can really lower the normal protections against illness. So anything that we do that can impact that can have an effect on them. As all of you know, all feeding volunteers are required to take basic food safety training. And the 2 major trainings we have is the feeding fundamentals, as well as the online basic food safety training, which I find really, really valuable trainings. They're quite extensive. These trainings are based on recognized food safety practices that are adopted by public health agencies. And that really allows for the consistency of feeding operations in our deployments. It is a lot of information, and many people may have taken it a while ago. Even I, who have done it a couple of times, you know, it's a lot of stuff. So that initial kitchen orientation is really important to remind staff of the key elements. Next slide. You know, the Red Cross operations are generally exempted from local health permits, but it's still regulated by local health departments, and you can be subject to inspection. And I have been visited on a couple of occasions by the county health departments. I wanted to show this. This is from Sacramento. Many of the counties have a self-inspection checklist and an extensive retail food inspection guide that you can use to refresh you. And granted, a lot of the items are focused on the restaurant environment where there's a full range of production activities. Not all of them will apply to Red Cross, but they do talk about temperature control, personnel, and equipment, and it is a nice inspection checklist. Next slide. So let's talk about the major causes of foodborne illness. Now, we've all heard about E. coli and Salmonella and norovirus foodborne outbreaks. These are bacteria along with their chemicals and their physical contaminants. These are the agents that cause foodborne illness. What we're talking about here are the actions which can introduce food safety hazards into food. Next slide. Okay, so we're all aware of poor personal hygiene and its impact on foodborne illness, how it can introduce it. We typically don't have to worry about food from unsafe sources. You know, the meals that we get can only be from commercial vendors, partner agencies, or other professional establishments that meet local and state federal sanitation codes. So typically we don't have to worry about that. We don't accept food donated by individuals or organizations that don't meet those standards. We do, however, accept non-perishable food that's unopened and undamaged and unexpired. So while the safe cooking is the responsibility of our suppliers, we don't have to worry about improper cooking. And we typically don't have to worry about improper thawing. But we do have to concern ourselves with cross-contamination and cross-contact issues, as well as time and temperature abuse. Next slide. Okay, we should all be fairly familiar with personal hygiene aspects for food safety. Here's the list. I'm not going to go into it all. You might want to take a couple of seconds here just to kind of look at the major food personal hygiene actions that need to be controlled. I do want to highlight that gloves need to be changed whenever they touch any unsanitized surface. And that means touching I do it all the time. I touch my jeans, or I touch my apron, or I touch whatever, and darn it, someone says, "Hey, your gloves," and change them out. I have never been on a DR, disaster response, where there weren't plenty of gloves. So I always emphasize to my staff, anytime you touch an unsanitized surface, just change out your gloves. The other thing is outer garments. This individual here is wearing a cloth vest. He's part of my feeding team when we were doing a canteen event. I control those. I know when they're clean. I wash them and I give them to my staff each time. On a big DR, you're having lots of people coming in and out. You're probably not going to be able to do that. So you always need to wear a plastic apron when doing feeding operations. And the last thing is jewelry. You're probably thinking, well, if I've got a ring and I have a glove, what's the problem? And that's probably protected. But you also have to think about things such as earrings and change that might get into bulk food if you're wearing them. And people do lose those, and it can go into food and cause problems. Next slide. So let's talk about cross-contamination. Cross-contamination refers primarily to the transfer of bacteria, physical contaminants, and most chemical contaminants. Cross-contact refers specifically to the transfer of allergens, which is technically a chemical contaminant, but because of the nature of the hazards, it has its own category. So that's the difference between cross-contamination and cross-contact. Obviously, exposed food, there's a higher likelihood of both cross-contamination and cross-contact. And obviously, temperature control is an area of concern, which we're going to talk about later. And I also believe whether it's exposed or not exposed, trying to limit self-service as much as possible. I see many times where people will pick up something, oh no, I don't want that one, or kids will come in. If you have the staff, try and do service to them, because there's just too much stuff that can go on in an uncontrolled situation. I've seen many photos of Red Cross feeding where there are actually exposed trays on a table, people with tongs handing out the foods with the client hovering over the trays. That wouldn't be acceptable. So if you have to do it that way, make sure that exposed food is maintained at a distance from the client so they can't peer over or touch it. Obviously, packaged, not exposed food is generally safer. However, it still needs to be protected. There has to be container integrity, temperature control. And one of the things that we learned was that norovirus can be transmitted very easily in ice baths with drinks in it, even though the bottled water or the whatever it was, the sports drinks were technically unexposed prepackaged food. Because they were in an ice bath and people are allowed to put their hands into it, norovirus did become an issue. And people have dirty hands, let's face it. So that is no longer an acceptable activity in a shelter. So now we've talked about personal hygiene. How about personal actions? Scratching your head or your body, sneezing, touching unsanitized surfaces with gloved hands, taking your apron or vest into the bathroom. All those kinds of things can have an effect on food safety, and supervisors should be monitoring those things. Gloved hands and contamination. This is one of my favorites. When I was a young health inspector, one of the things we had is all gloved hands do is keep your hands from getting dirty. I'm sure many of you have seen people in various establishments. They'll have glove hands and they'll go over and touch the money. They'll go over and touch the oven. They'll handle all kinds of equipment. They'll touch their aprons. It gives people a false sense of security. And so when monitoring your staff, make sure that if there is a glove that touches an unsanitary surface, that you just remind them to change it out. And obviously, maintaining equipment and utensils in a sanitary condition, and make sure that you place them on sanitary surfaces while you're serving. Next slide. So speaking of cleaning and sanitizing, in general, non-food contact surfaces, you use soap and water and you follow with a sanitizing spray. For food contact surfaces, there is a standard procedure, and that is you rinse it first, you wash it with soap and water and warm water, you rinse it again, and then you sanitize. And that's exactly the same protocol that's given in our Cambro procedures. So it is consistent across the board. You use standard unscented bleach if you don't have a nice kitchen, commercial kitchen that has sanitizers available to you. You're going to have to use bleach, and especially in remote areas, you may not have access to that. So the standard is unscented bleach, and the standard is 1 teaspoonful, which coincidentally, I did this myself. I put a capful and I measured it, and it comes out to one tablespoon per gallon of water. This may be a little bit nerdy, but sodium hypochlorite, which is NaCl, which is the chlorine in bleach, they come in different percentages. Typically, if you're buying standard high-grade Clorox type bleach, it's going to be from 5 to 9%. But there are, if you go to a dollar store or some of these other places, if that's what you got, you're going to have a slightly lower. And so you're not going to meet the effective sanitation concentration. So be aware of that. That little chart on the side is something I got, which talks about different percentages and proper dilution factors. Okay, next slide, please. As you know, when it comes to temperature control, it's an extremely important aspect in both hot and cold foods. So you all should be aware of the rule of 4, which is between 40 degrees and 140 degrees for 4 hours, or you will dispose of it. And that standard applies to both hot and cold foods. So put another way, food needs to be kept below 40 or below, and hot food needs to be kept 140 or above. Actually, the commercial standard, the regulatory standard is 41 and 135. But if you meet 40 and 140, you're obviously going to meet the regulatory standard. The reason why 40 and 140 is because bacteria can double in size, and it doubles exponentially in that temperature zone between 40 and 140. That's called the temperature danger zone. And if it isn't immediately noticeable to you, in order to take a temperature, you have to have a thermometer. I have talked to individuals who have been on deployments, and they have told me they never once saw a thermometer in the kitchen, which is probably not the way it should be. And if you do have a thermometer, you need to check temperatures regularly, especially when containers are open frequently and closed. They're going to cool off quicker than if they're in sealed containers. And when I've seen people, especially with those aluminum trays, and some community agency has donated whatever food, they're just open all the time. So they're going to cool off very, very quickly. I have had food that needed to be stored in ice chests because we did not have access to a refrigerator at the time. So you need to be very, very diligent in monitoring temperatures within ice chests. So remember, the rule of 4 also applies to excess food that might be donated. If you're at the 4-hour mark, you can't donate that food to other individuals because we would not accept that in our facility, so we're not going to dump it on somebody else. So you have to make sure that if you have excess food and you might be donating it, you give it enough time so that accepting receiving agency has enough time either to serve it and or cool it down in their refrigerator to an acceptable temperature. Next slide, please. So this is a picture of a label that the Southern Baptist provide for Cambros. Not all agencies provide this, but it has all of the information you're going to need to properly monitor the temperature. You obviously have the date, what's in it. It asks for serving sizes and servings, and we may or may not know that. It may just come in bulk, but at minimum, you're going to have the time at pickup and the temperature. And then throughout your serving time, you're going to have to monitor that over a period of time. And assuming that the food is prepared at 140 or 160 or whatever, and it gets picked up and it's still relatively warm at 150, 159, whatever it is, one would expect that you were going to take a temperature at the 1-hour period. And depending on how frequently you open and close that, you may want to take it at a half hour, you may want to take it at an hour, but certainly you should know when that 40 to 140 range is reached, and then that's when the clock starts for 4 hours. Next slide, please. Okay, next we're going to talk about something that we all should be concerned about, and that's food restrictions and allergies. So, next slide. If you notice the quote at the beginning, meals are served must meet the cultural, religious, and dietary needs of affected individuals, including infants and children, within 24 hours of the shelter opening. And that comes directly out of the feeding standards and procedures. So Mary talked about portion sizes and nutritional values and costs. We're going to talk about some of the other elements involved in meal considerations. And keep in mind, while we try to meet the dietary needs of everyone, there's going to be circumstances when we may not be able to do that, but we're going to do the best that we can, especially if there's a health consideration. I've found generally, unless there's an overriding religious or dietary reason, most people will just generally accommodate to what we serve. They're hungry, and as was mentioned, you know what? That's the reason why I came into feeding, because when the meals come, people's attitudes change. They just perk up and they're ready to go. So that's the nice thing about feeding. So we talk about preferences and restrictions, and there's an excellent document in OneSource called Food Restrictions and Allergens. Very, very detailed about religions and what's acceptable and what isn't. I can't go into all that detail now, but you can use that as a reference. Certainly, personally and culturally, some people may have a particular preference. Someone may prefer Asian food, Mexican food, whatever. And to the extent that we can provide that, we should try to accommodate it, especially if people are just not eating what we're providing and they're not getting the nutrition they need, then we may need to go to that extent if they just refuse to eat it. But as I said, generally, most people are going to eat the food that we try. And why there can be a variety of personal preferences, there is one personal preference that we always accommodate, and that is vegetarians. We typically account for 10 to 20% in meal ordering for vegetarians, and that can also actually accommodate other dietary restriction needs if we should need that. So food restrictions, I think, can be divided in two major categories. One is religious, obviously kosher for the Jewish, halal for the Muslim. Religions such as Hindus and Buddhists and Sikhs typically are vegetarians, and as I said, we do have that accounted for in some say. And there are a whole host of other religious observances that are outlined in the food restrictions document. The second is the medical, and people with diabetes certainly are ones that we're concerned about. We try to balance low carbohydrate with protein, fiber, and fat content. And there's a lot of information in that food restrictions document relative to diabetes. Gluten-free diet for people with celiac disease. Again, there's some information in the document that can guide you. We may need to deal with low sodium diets. Generally, when it comes to these considerations, there may be variations in people's adherence to those things. So it's a good rule to consult our nurses. We also can ask our client, hey, what is it that's going to be acceptable to you? What is it that you typically would eat? Or what can you tolerate? And they will be able to provide that information to us. When it comes to access and functional needs, we need to deal with individuals with disabilities or have access needs. That may include pureed food or soft food. In addition to that, volunteers may need to help those individuals. If they're having difficulty, we may have to actually feed them or assist them in some way. So those are things that have to be dealt with in shelters, and also considerations for the feeding supervisor. Another access need that we need to consider is first responders. If we're providing food to first responders, they typically have higher caloric needs because of their activities. And this is especially true for wildfire responders and firefighters. Another access consideration is food served during mass casualty events. Typically, the feeding sites are apart from where the site is. We've had a couple of family assistance centers here in Sacramento because of mass shootings. So we have to be careful of the type of food we serve. It has to be disaster sensitive, that doesn't remind people about the disaster. typically barbecues because of fire, spaghetti, rice, tomato sauces, chickens on the bone, those kinds of things all need to be considered. And I believe the document that I refer you to also has some information relative to that. Next slide. Finally, we need to talk about allergens. Up until last year, there were 8 allergens that were identified. These are the ones that are on the FDA list. They added sesame last year. And I think we're all aware of the dangers associated with allergens. Food Allergy Network has said that there have been over 170 foods reported that can cause reactions in people. So it's pretty widespread. Almost 11% of adults have allergies and 8% of children. So we're talking about a fair amount of people in our general population, which we serve, that are going to have these kinds of sensitivities. We all know about the peanut allergies, and there's a case here in Sacramento, a real tragic case in which the city of Sacramento was having a day camp, and the kids came in and they were required to report the allergen, and the allergens were reported. Someone reported a peanut allergy, but what they did not know is that that there was a little bit of peanut butter that was placed in the chocolate frosting in the cupcakes, and unfortunately the young girl died. So we know about that, but believe it or not, it's shellfish that has most people are allergic to, followed by milk, and peanut comes in third, and then followed by tree nuts. So it's just a kind of an interesting statistic. So the tricky part with allergen is knowing when it's in the food. Some food, it's fairly clear. We know that there's gluten in bread, so people with a gluten allergy, or a donut has sugar. But the name may not always tell you what's in the food. Menus can help, but there are variations by vendors in their recipes. And so being in contact with vendors is really important in making that determination. And when you're getting snacks, for supervisors and managers, they know when they're getting snacks, they need to look for hidden allergens so that when they put it out on the snack table, we're aware of it. And unfortunately, sometimes you just may not know. So that's why it's good to have communication with the nurses in identifying individuals. Unfortunately, it's been my experience that communication with DHS isn't always as good as it should be. So we have to take the responsibility and make sure that we find out. And fortunately, most people who have allergies know it. They let us know, so at least we have that. So that concludes my portion of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you so much, Mary. I see lots of questions in the chat. And before we jump into questions, I'd like to remind you all again that Mass Care webinar by the national headquarters by Mariana and her team is tomorrow at 2 o'clock Eastern time. So that's 2:14:11, so 11 o'clock Pacific Daylight Savings Time. And I encourage you to join and hear all the news about WebEOC and other topics. And next week, we're going to talk about more on the feeding topics. Our presenter team, Kay, Mary, Michael, would you be one of our DPMs, disaster program managers or specialists, that said she observes Ramadan? Would you be open for her to share some tips for Ramadan with us?
Of course. Yeah, I think
Absolutely.
one of the reasons that it was suggested that you go to a local religious leader in your area is so that you actually have buy-in from that community. But I would love to hear the answer.
And
Thank
then
you, thank you.
and Iwe, then if we could get,
yes.
we have quite a few questions. If we could get to those questions, that would be great. I
Yes.
promised people we would.
Yes, definitely. Let me unmute people for 1 second, and let me find her first. I'm so sorry. Give me a few seconds.
So while you're finding her, let me just give
Yes.
you the 5 national partners that we have. Someone was asking that question. Can't seem to locate exactly where it is right now on one source, but it's the Salvation Army, World Central Kitchen, Mercy Chefs, Southern Baptist, and Firehouse Subs. Did I miss any? I don't think so.
I think that's it.
Okay, Camila, I think you can come off mute. I
Yeah.
unmuted everyone.
One of the things to note for Ramadan is people observe they have fasting from sunrise to sunset. So anytime in between sunset and sunrise, they can eat. A lot of people who observe who fast, they usually break their fast with water and dates or coffee. So those are some things to definitely have on hand. And depending on what type of foods they are or what community they're from, it'll depend what kind of food they want. So you definitely like no pork, nothing with gelatin in it or any kind of porcine product. But a lot of it, I mean, it's going to depend on whatever foods they eat, but they can't have any water or any type of food whatsoever, any drink between sunrise and sunset. So that's just something to keep in mind.
Thank you. And team, if we may get to, we promised last time that we'll get to some of the questions from last time. If any of would you like to answer, does the Red Cross ever use rented vehicles for movements and distribution of supplies, equipments, etc.? And if so, how does the driver pay for the fuel? Anyone wants to take that?
The card, it should have, when it was ordered, a P card should have been put down on it. And then if it's not accepted, then a volunteer who has that P card will have to go with that driver to pick it up.
Thank you, Kay. And I think the question is more on how do they pay for the fuel?
Oh, the
We'll use
fuel.
the P
I'm
card,
sorry.
yeah.
I thought you
We'll
said
use the P
food.
card. Sorry, fuel, the gas.
Well, if it's a Red Cross vehicle, it should be a Red Cross vehicle if possible, and it's a fuel card. Or the worst case scenario is you use your mission card on your private vehicle, and then you can get that back on by going through the normal process for recharging your mission card. You do not use your P card or an MCPC card to fill gas.
Thank you. And I'd also like to add that for a disaster relief operations, you can also request from the Disaster Logistics Center for the Element Fuel Card. For Guam, we requested and it was shipped to them. So there are multiple ways that we can pay for it. Okay, another question for the team. We have our local food bank has a kitchen that prepares food and is subject to regular inspection. Can we collaborate with them when we have local disasters?
Absolutely.
Yes.
We use our food banks extensively. So that's a great partner. It's a great way to develop that relationship during your steady state, during blue skies, and you'll love it.
Thank you so much. We seem to have quite a few questions on snacks, whether to count it or not. So we have a question for the team that when we say we don't count any snacks, does it only apply to larger disaster relief operations or it applies to all disaster relief operations?
I'm going to refer back to Lauren Myers, who is the National Senior Director for Feeding, and she says we do not count snacks.
Yeah.
Now, that being said, that refers to when we are reporting on the 5266, which is a form we report things to. There's no place on it anymore. If your local person is asking you, like your executive director is asking you to keep track of the snacks, okay, that's something totally different. But for our purposes in feeding, there's a formula for a disaster when we start feeding people that is an automatic formula that gets added and counted. And in my particular region, I believe we figure 5 snacks per person per day. Michael, can you verify that for me?
I believe that is correct.
Okay, do you want to further comment? I know the snack is a big
no.
issue because it's changed.
Right. No, I think you covered it.
Okay.
Thank you. So just to emphasize, the feeding team does not report snacks on the 5266 form, the operation control form. But if your local teams or government liaisons or anyone wants that number, we're able to give that number. It's just that we're not reporting it on the form. Okay. Another question that we have 5 minutes. I present to the team that if we go to a restaurant and we need low sugar, low sodium, or soft meals, do we have a definition for Red Cross that what is considered low sodium or low sugar?
In the feeding toolkit, there is no specific definition of what a low sodium or low sugar would be. My advice would be to work with the shelter nurse and work with the client. The client's been told how many milligrams of sugar, if they're on a low salt or low sugar diet, they've been told how many milligrams of salt they should have per day. Ask the client, they will tell you. And then that will help guide your purchase and your choice to make sure they're getting healthy food. We certainly want to be careful with these medical restrictions, and our best approach is the client and our shelter nurse.
Thank you, Mary. And we have a question. We have a raised hand. Veta, would you like to come off mute and share your question?
You're still on mute, Veta, if you're talking.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. I'm wondering if we have any sort of survey or we ask clients when they check in if they have any allergies. I think that could be helpful for overall consideration of food sources.
Yes, we do. And this is not my area of expertise. So I'm going to let one of my colleagues jump in, but I know it's on the SKIA form somewhere.
That is correct. So when the clients check in, when we check them in, we ask them if they have any immediate needs or if they have any allergies or dietary restrictions. So those are on the form or on the website itself when we register our clients. And okay, we still have time for 2 minutes. We also have a question that clients, they might not all have the same working hours. So if they come, they have a night shift, they're coming late, does the kitchen ever close? Can they come in to get something if it's quote unquote after the official meal time? Team?
Well, I'll start and then let both my other colleagues comment on it. Certainly you want to try and accommodate all of our clients in the shelter. So if you happen to know that someone is working late and they're going to be late and you have a meal that's been delivered that's hot, if you have a way to either keep it hot or cool it quickly and then reheat it for them, I would definitely say that is something within the realm of possibilities and something we would try and do. If we don't, then I think we have to look at other arrangements for that individual, because we can't just hold hot food for 4 or 5 hours and not either have it chilled to the appropriate temperature and then reheated or maintained at the appropriate heat level. Michael or Kay, do you want to comment?
I agree with what you said, Mary, and what we need to do is we just need to accommodate him. If we know in advance, then I would order food to be picked up or delivered much later to accommodate his needs or her need.
Perfect. One more question?
Thank you. We have one more question that, how can we assist clients when they have physical feeding needs? Do we coordinate with other functions such as, individual disaster care to help us with it?
Yes,
Please.
you would want to coordinate with IDC and the access and functional needs person who's on the disaster relief operations.
Thank you. And maybe we'll take one more. John Osmond, would you like to come off mute for the very last question?
Yeah, one time I was on the DR and stuff when we did a shelter. When you do the allergy thing, sometimes we have a special brace that we put on them, and then we know, and they tell us in the kitchen or whatever doing the feeding, hey, this person got an allergy, they can't have this. That helps a lot right there.
Thank you.
Thank you. It is 6:30. We will conclude this session. The recording will be posted on YouTube within a week, and all your feeding kits, the sample feeding kits and slides will be sent out with an email as well. And I think we didn't get to Jane and also Lyle or Brendan. If you don't mind typing your questions in the chat, and we'll make sure to get to it next time. Thank you so much all, and we'll see you next week.